Genesis 14, 1 through 24. We are not going to read the whole thing. We'll just jump straight into it and keep using our story arc to help us break down the text. Here we go. At the time when Amraphel was king of Shinar, Arioch king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer king of Elam, and Tidal king of Goyim, these kings went to war against Bera king of Sodom, Bersha king of Gomorrah, Shinab king of Admah, Shemeber king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these latter kings joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Dead Sea Valley. For 12 years they'd been subject to Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. So we're getting the setting in verses 1 through 4, and let's go ahead and start to put this in. So actually, kind of verse 3 gives us the backstory. You have 12 years of paying tribute. And then kind of the whole thing is in the next part, verses 1 through 4. 1 through 4. Here, they rebel, right? And you have the kings of, so if you kind of have your map, just kind of imagine your map, you have your kings of Canaan. And they're kind of scattered in here, these 5 kings. And then over here, actually in Babylon, you have these 4 kings. 1, 2, 3, 4. Their chief king is Kedorlaomer. And the chief king over here is the king of Sodom, whose name I can't remember, but we'll see it when we go back up. And this coalition of 5 kings goes against this coalition of 4 kings. These guys have been paying tribute to Kedorlaomer for 12 years, and in the 13th year, they stop. So these guys say, time to go get our money, and they begin their very long journey over to ancient Israel, Canaan, and make war against these other kings, kind of led by the king of Sodom. So let's come back up to verse 5 and continue. Just real quick. So we have these 4 right here. 1, 2, 3, 4. And Kedorlaomer of Elam is the first one. And they go up against, we'll do it in blue. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These ones, right? So we have blue versus black here. That's what this little part right here, these kings went to war against, right? And then we get the location of this whole battle. Where is this happening? In the valley of Siddim, that is the Dead Sea Valley. Historically, the Dead Sea Valley wasn't always a sea, but it became that over time. And in this season, there's still quite a bit of greenery there. Anyways, we'll continue. For 12 years, they had been subject to Kedorlaomer. That's the background. But in the 13th year, they rebelled, which is why these kings up here go to war against these kings down here. All right. In the 14th year, so 13th year, they rebel. In the 14th year, so that's next year, Kedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, that's these 4 guys up here, went out and defeated and then these names right here, they're all different than the names that came up before that. The Rephaites, so let's kind of we'll put these victories in green. 1, the Rephaites in Ashtreth Karnaim. 2, the Zuzites in Ham. 3, the Emites in Shaveh-Kiriathaim. 4, the Horites and in the hill country of Syria as far as Paran in the desert. Then they turned back and went to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and they conquered the whole territory of the Amalekites. That's 5, as well as the Amorites who were living in Hazazon Tamar. Okay, so if we're kind of paying attention to what just happened, Kedorlaomer and the other 4 kings, so this is a total of 4, so Kedorlaomer and the other 3 kings, they go to battle and they take out 6 groups. So let's kind of go back to our terrible map. These guys just came over and they attacked the guys who live here, 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 and who live here. They just went and destroyed everybody outside of the land of Canaan, which means that for these guys inside, this is a terrifying year as Chedorlaomer just goes and conquers everybody that he hasn't already conquered. And once he's done surrounding these guys, he's like, all right, now it's your turn. So in verses 5 through 8, we see the conquest of Chedorlaomer. And what this means is that, you know what, let me move this little dot a little bit further up. We'll go all the way up here, right? Because that's a whole year of conquest. What this means for us is what the writer is trying to get us to see is that Chedorlaomer is unstoppable, right? He's this unstoppable, undefeatable king. Well, that in and of itself would just be demoralizing, right? But nevertheless, the kings draw up for battle. The king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah. I think we put these guys in blue, right? So let's go. These are our blue kings. The king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, right? Zoar. So these 5 are ready. They marched out. They drew up their battle lines in the valley of Shittim, which is what we just saw up here in verse 3. Against our kings in black, king of Elam, Chedorlaomer, 2, king title of Goyim, 3, Raphel, king of Shinar, and 4, Ariok, king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. That's our kind of summary here. These kings over here in black, they have much larger nations, much larger spheres of influence than these kings over here in Canaan. These kings are kind of small compared to these ones. These are they control much larger territories. And so even though it's 4 against 5, it's probably the case that these guys have more men. Now, that's the battle. We're back to the beginning of the battle, and we get this little kind of summary, or it's not summary, but this extra piece of info. And never do these pieces of info come to us without reason. If there are details, there's a reason for them. The valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and when the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, he doesn't even describe the battle. It was just a wash. They lost. All right, that's the point. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, right? So that's these 2 guys, kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, they fled. Some of the men fell into them, and the rest fell into the hills. So into them is the tar pits, and the rest went to the hills. Later, when Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed, that is where Lot will go. But on this day, either the king of Sodom or the king of Gomorrah fled and fell into a tar pit. Now, these tar pits are not the same as we have in like I think it's La Bira, something like that. It's in LA. And there's these tar pits, and you can find all sorts of fossils in them because if animals got stuck in there, they usually died. That's not the kind of tar pit that we have in the valley of Siddim. The Dead Sea has beneath it like bitumen rising up from the surface. And as the waters of the Dead Sea would go up and then down, there would be these sinkholes in the area around, which are still there to this day and form frequently. These sinkholes would be filled with kind of the leftover bitumen. And so there would be the sinkhole with a layer of dark mud, this leftover bitumen. And so they're called tar pits, but they're not the kind of tar pits that we have in LA. They're kind of sinkholes filled with dark bitumen mud, which means that they are escapable. And in fact, they're a place of refuge. They're a hiding place. It would have been a disgusting, smelly, gross hiding place, but nevertheless, it was one. So when the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, they ran away, they fall into these pits. And it's like that. It's probably the case that they are hiding in them, that the king of Sodom may be in one of these pits, and that'll be important later on. The 4 kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food, and then they went away. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. So let's go back down to the bottom. We got verses 8 through 9 giving us the background. Okay, so 10 and 11. All right, here we go. So verses 8 through 9, battle, right? Verse 10, king of Sodom flees into pit, right? That's kind of the question here. And then verse 11 is a big deal. Lot is kidnapped. Now, there was an important detail there in Lot's kidnapping, and that was that Lot was in Sodom. Now, before, he was just in the plains, right? He had been in the plains, and now it's telling us that he is in the city. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that the case? How did this come to be? Well, it may be that Lot is in the city as a place of refuge. It may be that Lot was actually in the plains near the city and got kidnapped. But if it's the case that Lot is full on in the city, then that means that he has sold his flocks, no more tent, and now has a home in Sodom, right? And in this way, if that's the case, and it's very likely that this is the case, he's kind of going on the opposite path of Abram. And if that is the case, then this kidnapping is sort of like a consequence, a natural consequence of not being someone who pitches their tent and lives here, but somebody who becomes part of this world of sin that we see in Sodom. Oops. All right. So there's just like a little interesting lesson there. Verse 13, a man who had escaped came and reported this to Abram, the Hebrew. This is interesting that Abram is now referred to as the Hebrew. The Hebrew could literally mean like one from beyond, or from far away, or something like that. It essentially becomes this word for foreigner. And this is what the Hebrews will be known as forever. Whether they're in Egypt or they're in Israel, like they're called the Hebrews. And it's just super cool that that's kind of built into the identity of the people. Now, Abram was living near the great trees of Mamre, the Amorite. So the great trees of Mamre are called that because the Amorite's name is Mamre. These are his trees. So he's living near the great trees of Mamre. They belong to Mamre, the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol and Aner, all of whom were allied with Abram. So these three men, Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner, are not kings. They are just powerful heads of families. And in that way, they are very like Abraham. They don't lead entire armies, but they have powerful households. And they are allied with Abram. And so Abram stands in contrast where he doesn't live in the city of sin, but he does make friends with his nearby neighbors, Mamre, Eshcol, and Ner. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. So the armies, back to my map. The battle takes place pretty far in the south. So Sodom kind of down here in the valley of Shittim. And the army begins to head back this way to Babylon. And Abram is living over here. Actually, not quite over there. He's probably living over here. And he begins to pursue the army up to Dan. And we're going to see that he'll go all the way up to Damascus, which is kind of up here. So he's going to pursue them for many, many miles. So we'll go back up, make sure I got my verses right. Verses 13 through 14. That's the next one. So up here, verses 13 through 14, Abram goes to war with allies. We know that Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre are there in the battle because they get a spoil of the war. So let's go back up. he called out the 318 men of his household and went and pursued as far as Dan. Abram has a massive household. That is huge, right? And Amorites, the Mamre, Eshcol, and Ur, maybe they have something similar, right? So we're looking at here, let's say they all are just massively powerful families. We're looking here at like 1,200 men, max, right? It's highly likely that Abram has more than these guys because their households are related. We're not looking at a large army. 318 may be the bulk, but it was nowhere near what the 5 kings were bringing. So he brings out his trained men. They go in pursuit as far as Dan. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus, so super far. He recovers all the goods, brings back his relative Lot and all his possessions, together with the women and the other people. This story should remind you of Gideon, does it not? About 300 men attacking a much larger force in the middle of the night and just totally annihilating them, right? We know that with Gideon, this was only possible with God, that God fought for Gideon. And so we could assume the same thing here, but the question will be in these coming verses, who gets the glory? So let's go back down. Verse 13, Abraham goes to war with allies. Verse 15 through 16. Let me move this. Let me move this down. Goes to war. Verse 15 through 16. Wins against all odds. The guys who were unstoppable right here are routed by this tiny army from Abram. Obviously, God is at work, right? God is at work. The question is going to be up here at the climax, who gets the glory? So let's come back up. After Abram returned from defeating Kedorlaomer, the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shavah, that is the king's valley. So it says he came out to meet him. It might be that he was inside of his little dirty pit hiding until Abram came back, right? Or maybe he did get out of the pit and he retreats back into his place of rest, or whatever the case may be. The king of Sodom is not participating in the battle. Like a coward with his tail between his legs, he comes out to see Abram and meets him in the king's valley. We'll go back down to the bottom. So kind of verse 17 here. King of Sodom reappears, right? And come back up. We'll go to verse 18. Then Melchizedek comes out. The king of Salem brought out bread and wine. There's other scriptures that kind of show us that this is kind of like a common post-battle meal. So the king of Melchizedek comes out. The king of Salem, his name is Melchizedek, comes out. He was priest of the Most High God. So Melchizedek is both king and priest. He is the priest king. Also, he is the king of Salem. Now, Salem, right? Shalom, peace, right? Peace. And in the future, it will be called Jerusalem. That is because another group of people eventually will inhabit this city, and Jeru comes from the name of that people. Forever after that, it'll be Jerusalem. But right now, it's just simply Salem. Melchizedek is the king, and he is the priest. Now, notice this. He is priest of God Most High. That is El Elyon, God Most High, which means that they believe in one God above every other thing. The people of Salem worship the one true God. They don't worship the false gods of the Canaanites. They worship Yahweh. Although they don't call him that, they don't have his name. Instead, they refer to God as God Most High, El Elyon. This is a big deal. If you go read Hebrews 7 through 10, you'll discover that Jesus is called a priest after the order of Melchizedek. He's not a Levitical priest. The Levitical priest is beneath the priesthood of Melchizedek because Abraham gives him a tenth of everything. which means that Melchizedek is greater than the Levitical priesthood because the Levites are in Abraham, right? So that's just really crucial, the argument of Hebrews 7 through 10. I don't have time to go into all that right now. I just encourage you to read that. The king of Salem comes out. He blesses Abraham and he says, "Blessed be Abraham by God Most High," which just kind of goes back to what God has already done with Abraham, creator of heaven and earth, right? The single creator of heaven and earth, El Elyon. This is true worship of the true God. And praise be to God Most High. So Melchizedek is giving the glory to God. He doesn't say, Abraham gets the credit. He's the mighty warrior. He says, praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hands, right? Because it was against all odds that Abram and his coalition of families beats a coalition of kings from Babylon. All right, let's go back down, 18 through 20. So this is really the climax of it, the beginning of the climax. Verses 18 through 20, Melchizedek's blessing right here. And the question becomes, what is Abraham going to do in response? Is he going to take the glory or what? And he gives him a tenth of everything, right? So to me, that's really just, somewhere in here. It's the height of tension. Verse 20, Abram gives a tenth. Which means this, that Abraham agrees with Melchizedek's words. Abram agrees that God Most High has done this. Abraham submits to the priesthood of Melchizedek, and Abraham gives God the glory by giving the priest, Melchizedek, a tenth of everything, because he's not giving it to the priest, he's giving it to the priest of God Most High. It's an offering to God. This is a huge deal. And right then and there, he gets a temptation. And this is kind of in the following action. Maybe you could say it's part of the part of the tension too. Verse 21. Here is the test, if you will. It's the king of Sodom, and he says something that would be tempting. He says, "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." Right? It's like saying, "You've earned it. You did it, Abraham. You won the battle. Keep the goods for yourself. Keep the glory." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, with raised hand, "I have sworn an oath to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth." He calls him God Most High, El Elyon, right? It's the same God he worships. It's Yahweh, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you. Abram has no respect for the king of Sodom. Maybe he knows that the king of Sodom is this slimy, evil character. Or maybe he just doesn't want to give Sodom any credit this day. Not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, "I made Abram rich." Right? The temptation here, the bait is, keep the goods for yourself. But the danger is, that the king of Sodom could steal some glory from the Lord or take credit for what has happened in Abram's life. And so Abram says, "I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten." That's the bread and the wine, which, by the way, came from the king of Melchizedek, a king of Salem, and the share that belonged to the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them have their share. So, king of Sodom tempts Abram. And verse 22 through 24, Abram wins. And then the final piece here, 24 again, shares with allies. So this whole portion right here, from verse 20 to 24, is just an epic saga of worship. worship and glory. Anyways, okay. At the end, he says, the share that belongs to the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them have their share. So those three guys that he lives next to who went into battle with him, he lets them keep it. And there's a beautiful piece of wisdom in that, which is like, use Sodom's goods to build relationships with neighbors. So he doesn't use it and keep it for his own glory, but he does use it to build up his relationship with his allies. And I think that's just wise. How do you live as wise as serpent and as innocent as doves in this world? That's the kind of stuff that you do. You use Sodom's goods to build relationships with your unbelieving neighbors. So anyways, that is the story that we have here. It's got just a great flow to it. And I really think that worship is the key lesson in this story. And therefore, as sojourners and strangers, we have to remember that we will too face battles, that God too will go before us and overcome insurmountable odds. And when those moments comes, the question is, who gets the glory? And it will be tempting to keep it for yourself or tempting to give it to the world, but we worship God. We give him the glory. One way we do that is actually by a tithe, right? A 10%. I think that's a great way to say, God, you gave me this and I'm giving it back to you. But also in what we say and what we do, we can worship God, the God of glory, through our high priest, Melchizedek, after the order of Melchizedek, Jesus Christ.